Good evening and a very warm welcome to Murder One. We are back online and in person this year with our first hybrid festival. My name's Sam Blake and I'm the founder and director of Murder One, and I'm thrilled that you can join us tonight. This year, Murder One is supported by Laoghaire-Rathdown Libraries with our in-person events running in the stunning Lexicon venue in Dunleary. But this year, we're also supported by the Arts Council of Ireland, which is enabling us to live stream many of our events, making Murder One accessible to everyone via their laptop, and obviously to events like this evening. We're delighted to be joined by Hanff Korelitz, who will be chatting to the critically acclaimed author Henrietta McKervey, who is also the driving force behind the Echoes Festival honouring Maeve Binchy. I'm going to hand you over to Henrietta now, and she'll be able to tell you a little bit more about Jean and her career. Over to you, Henrietta.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thanks. I'd like to offer a very hearty Murder One welcome to our guest, Hanff Korelitz.
That doesn't sound so good.
It sounds great. New York Times best-selling author, which sounds really brilliant, of 8 novels, including one of my absolute favourite recent books, The Plot, You Should Have Known, which was adapted for HBO as The Undoing, starring Hugh Grant, Donald Sutherland, Nicole Kidman, and some very gorgeous clothes.
Oh, yes.
They were so nice. And Admission, about the fraught world, way more fraught than I would have thought it was, world of American college admissions, which was also adapted as a film starring Tina Fey a few years back. Mm-hmm. And Jean's new novel, The Latecomer, is a satisfyingly sprawling saga about an enviably wealthy, I bet they could all afford those coats, but seriously dysfunctional Jewish American family. And it was published in July to rave reviews. So welcome, Jean. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know people will be keen to hear all about You Should Have Known and its life as The Undoing, because it was a very big hit in Ireland during lockdown, and also to talk about your other books. But maybe we could begin by talking about the newcomer, The Latecomer, and you do a short reading. By
the way, I have never written a novel that has had its title so mangled by well-meaning readers, posters, even reviewers. The Newcomer is one of the most popular misnames of The Latecomer. But so I'm just going to read the prologue, which is quite short. And the great thing about reading a prologue is you really don't have to prepare the way for it. I mean, this is the first thing you see when you open the book. So here we go. The Oppenheimer triplets, who were thought of by not a single person who knew them as the Oppenheimer triplets, had been in full flight from one another as far back as their ancestral petri dish. Not one of the three, Harrison, the smart one, Lewin, the weird one, or Sally, the girl, had a speck of genuine affection for either of the others, or had ever once thought of a sister or a brother with anything resembling a sibling bond, let alone as counterparts in a tender and eternal family relationship. And this despite the years of all-consuming effort from at least one of their parents, to say nothing of the staggering advantages they had enjoyed, beginning with the not inconsiderable price tag of their making. No, a lingering discontent overhung each of those three, and had, since they were old enough to glean their shared origin story, judge their parents, and basically make up their minds about the other two. For 18 years, they'd been together, from that petri dish to their crowded maternal womb, to their shared home on the Brooklyn Esplanade, and their shared summer cottage, not really a cottage, on the vineyard, and their shared education, or indoctrination, in Harrison's view, at the lauded Walden School of Brooklyn Heights, where a frankly socialist ethos stood in bald contrast to soaring tuition. And at no point did they ever grow closer, not even slightly, not even out of pity for their mother, who had wanted that so badly. And then they were 18, and not just leaving home, but desperate to begin 3 permanently separate adult lives, which is exactly what would have happened if the Oppenheimer family hadn't taken a turn for the strange and quite possibly unprecedented. But it did. We did. And that has made all the difference. Little Robert Frost reference there for those paying attention.
Thank you so much. So when the triplets leave for college, Johanna, the mother, who's faced with the idea of being truly alone for the first time in almost 2 decades, right, she makes the decision to add a 4th child to the family, who is the latecomer.
crazy decision. I mean, I don't know if you have kids, but I can tell you that when your last child leaves for college, pretty much the last thing you're thinking about is starting all over again with an infant.
And also an infant that's the same, the whole genetic age as the others. When I came to that part,
that's right. This is the triplets are born sort of at the dawn of in vitro fertilization, and as becomes clear, the three that are implanted in this poor woman who's already, gone through many unsuccessful rounds of in vitro fertilization. These are not supposed to be the ones that make it. The one that's supposed to get born is the one that's being put aside in a freezer to await a more competent gestational carrier, i.e., a 20-year-old girl somewhere. But in fact, after all of this failure, these three triplets are born alive and kicking, even though they loathe one another from birth, and they never, at least for the first part of their lives, come to respect or like one another.
Yeah. And it seems their parents are the same. There's a lovely line quite early on in which their father, I think as if the fatherhood protocol had been explained to him by authorities.
He'd have to have it explained to him that what it means. But the problem is, and I do get asked this a lot, like, what is wrong with these three? What's wrong with them is that their entire family has been created on a fault line, which is that the father has been responsible for a terrible accident that has taken the lives of two people. And for some reason, the parents decide not to share this with the children. I don't know that it would have even made that much of a difference if they had, but to my way of thinking, this goes the longest way to explaining what the problem is in this family. Another problem is that there is this other child out there who is their full sibling, who was created at the same instant they were, and has been in a freezer for 18 years. And it is only when that child arrives 18 years later that there's even a prayer of this family reaching some kind of completion and peace, frankly. So I always knew that the job of this latecomer was to solve the problem of their family, and that is what they do. And the way they do it is so kind of, I mean, that's where the plot kicks in, frankly, that, you've had a long period of a lot of people doing a lot of different things. And somehow this character comes along and just weaves it all together. And I'm sort of not even sure how she does it. I mean, I know I wrote it and everything, but sometimes, and I'm sure this is, I hope this has happened to you. You just find the solutions as you're writing the book, and you think, "Wow, that is just so fabulous." So
one of the things I loved about it actually was because it's written in Phoebe's voice. So the hour that we know, the OUR that we start with, as she's talking about her siblings and her family, and we don't really know at the beginning who is this hour at first. Is it one of the triplets? Is it going to move around between voices? And then it's this very wide sort of, it has so much energy to it, this voice, and it's so sort of omniscient in so many ways. And then as the character of Phoebe becomes a living character in the book, the voice has to shrink down to become a human-sized form. So
that's very well put. It's also the first time I've attempted a first-person narrator, basically since I was at university. It is not my comfortable place. I'm much more comfortable in a kind of omniscient third person. But and I think part of the reason this book took so long to write, I mean, so long that I literally stopped in the middle and wrote another book, the plot, is because I hadn't figured out some of these basic questions, like whose story is this and who is telling it. So yes, I know you agree.
Because it has an omniscient first person, which is actually an unusual blend to until we shrink. And then she becomes as human and yet this amazing sort of binding force and redemptive force in her family. I really enjoyed the way it takes on grief and guilt and generational trauma, as well as having a sort of sly, fun poke at privilege and what are incredibly recognizable family dynamics, regardless of economic circumstances.
Yeah.
So perhaps you could tell us a bit about where the idea for how did all of these ingredients end up in this bowl together?
Well, you use the word ingredients. I mean, there were more ingredients in this novel than anything I've ever attempted to write before. And that may have been another part of the long and winding road of this book. What novelist is not interested in families? Families are the gift that keeps on giving. And family order and family structure and family secrets. I mean, you could walk down the aisle of your local bookstore and just say family, and they're all different books. So I was interested in the idea of being born later, sort of missing your family. I actually read a memoir by a British writer, Susie Boyd, about her family, and she was born much later than her older siblings, who had this wonderfully bohemian childhood in the 70s. And by the time she came along, the parents were separated, and it was her and her mom alone in an apartment. And when people would say to her, "Oh, I know all about your famous family,
your famous dad," and she had a completely different relationship with him than her siblings.
That's right. And she would say, "Well, actually, it was just me and my mom alone in a flat in London." And I thought about that a lot. And then when you add the kind of assisted fertility, there's a whole kind of human random element that comes into it. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, who gets implanted, who gets sent to the freezer. At one point, these triplets are sort of going, well, it could have been you, me, and her, or you, him, and it could have been an entirely different family. But when, the question that I couldn't let go of was, what is it going to be like for that last child when they realize that they miss their family? Their family happened somewhere else to other people. By the time Phoebe comes along, there have been huge changes in this family. She is literally missing one parent. And that must be just an existential mind, explosion to know that because some lab tech picked you to be sent away for later for the successful implantation, all of these epic things happened and you missed them all. So
for something that's considered a sort of a scientific process, her existence is actually as random as if she was conceived naturally.
Absolutely.
It has that level of, if it wasn't today, it might have been yesterday, feels so.
You ruminate on these things, and then the characters just sort of start to come to you. And because this, I once wrote a novel with 3 protagonists, but usually one is, comfortable for me. There are 6 major characters, you might call them protagonists, in this novel. And at some point, I just found myself assigning to them many of the little things that I'm obsessive about. I mean, I have a passionate interest in Mormon history, for example. That's in this book. I'm totally into antiques. That's in this book. Right-wing politics, fascinating to me. That's in this book. Progressive education, all of these kind of little things that, all the ingredients, as you call them, that are part of my daily life. I just took the opportunity to assign them to one of these characters. And it was, I didn't know if that was going to work.
It must have been enormously satisfying to do that.
It was a lot of fun. I mean, I did have, there were kind of partisan fans and non-fans of various things. I mean, my mother in particular kept saying, nobody wants to read about the Mormons. Take the Mormons out. I wouldn't do it. So
I loved the antiques angle, particularly. Actually, with Sally, it just felt like such a generously but also gentle redemption for her to find herself among the paraphernalia of domestic life in a way she'd never felt able to access a domestic existence as a child.
All of these triplets are looking for home in one way or another. And they, despite all those advantages, and this, as you said, this is a very wealthy family, they have all the ingredients, but they didn't have a family. So they're all out there looking, and they're not going to get what they either know they need or don't know they need until the latecomer of the title comes along.
Yeah, it has actually there's a big juicy plot here with a lot of twists, which are very satisfying for the reader. And like, to be honest, plot twists don't always go hand in hand with a literary novel. So, and I read in a Guardian interview, I think it was, where you talking about wanting to be a literary novelist, but you also really like plot. Like, do you think there's a sort of snobbishness about plot in so-called literary fiction?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, is there ever? When I began my writing life as a poet, and I went to university in the UK, and I was only writing poetry then. And the first novels that I attempted to write, and I'm sure there's a lot of fear about writing anything, but I think in particular a novel, it's such a big, scary thing. And a mistake you make on page 1 may doom you on page 399 if you're not fortunate and careful. So I was writing poetry, and when I finally became brave enough to attempt a novel, it was a very poetic, prose forward. Characters were a little blurry. You didn't really see them too clearly. Plot, who cared what actually happened? This was about the prose, the beauty of the prose. And those novels were never published. Nobody wanted to publish them. And then my first child had just been born, and I was very, very worried that I would never write a novel now. When am I going to write a novel now? And I just decided I am going to write something that somebody will publish. And the year was 1992. And, legal thrillers were a big thing. And in fact, I had sort of witnessed the birth of the legal thriller because I had been working in publishing, and my boss had published Presumed Innocent, which, of Grisham, Scott Turow had really kind of created the genre. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write a legal thriller, which was a very very crazy thing to do because, of course, I'm not an attorney. And that was the book that was first published. So then I had a different problem, which is that my brand new publisher, and I was so thrilled to have a publisher, immediately wanted me to write a sequel with the same character. The character I named after my husband, the character's name was Sibylla Muldoon, which is still the greatest, greatest name of a character I've ever come up with. Named after Sibylla Melvin from the Australian novel My Brilliant Career, and of course my husband. So then I had this real kind of two roads diverged in a yellow road. That was the Robert Frost line that was referenced in that passage I read from the Latecomer. And was I going to be this legal thriller writer with the same character, with Sibylla Muldoon down through the ages, or was I going to try to go back in the direction that I'd come? And that was the decision I made, whereupon I lost my hard-won editor. And I think that is frankly how I managed to get to 8 novels without anybody knowing who I was, because I kept shifting, going back and forth between more plot-driven, less plot-driven. But I do love plot. And as a reader, I'm always so thrilled when there's a really satisfying plot twist, whether it's a thriller or a literary novel. So my goal is to always have them if I can possibly figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I noticed actually one of the interesting things that I thought as well about the Latecomer was the idea of passing and appropriation are quite central to it. I mean, appropriation is something we get, gets a lot of airtime at the moment. And I don't do any spoilers in terms of the plot, but everybody is passing themselves off as something that they're not, some more convincingly than others. Like Joanna is passing herself on as this successful matriarch with her children who all hold hands for photos because that's what they do in real life. And of course they don't. And I think that was something you've touched on before, like in Admission. For example, the excerpts of the college essays, which are the chapter headings, are essentially a series of teenagers trying to pass themselves off as a college-worthy applicant. And is this something that you think is this sort of a thread that runs through your writing, this people never quite being who they are?
One of the fun things about getting to this many novels, which frankly I never thought would ever happen, is looking back and sort of seeing the connective tissue among them, which you're perhaps not aware of when you're actually writing them. So when I look back at these 8 novels, I see a fixation not only on university, but on the act of going to university, leaving home, and sort of entering that phase of life. Also, appropriation pops up all the time. I mean, even back in, I think in my second novel, there was a plagiarism element, and then more in admission, and of course, that's what the plot is about, the idea of who owns what and who's entitled to use their own experiences, one another's experiences. So yes, it's almost like I'm waiting for it to turn up in every single book of mine, the plagiarism, the appropriation.
Which must be very interesting in that you've spanned so many diverse areas to actually see these things with hindsight and realize these threads are actually running through all of the books, or to greater or lesser degree. I mean, I find I've written crime and historical fiction, and I have a similar sort of, I do actually, that thing that's, there might be 200 years and completely different plot separation of things, and you realize that's the preoccupation. These are it might be better if I realized it before I wrote them, but
no, not at all.
Yeah,
it's nice to be surprised. I mean,
it is actually, that's true.
I read the reviews to find out what my books are about. I mean, there was an amazing New York Times review that called me the new Edith Wharton, and I thought, I better go back and read Edith Wharton because it's been a long time, and not really one of my favorite authors, but obviously there's something there. Somebody else.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. I read somewhere that the plot that became the plot sort of appeared from nowhere.
It did.
During the meeting, as you were talking about the book. Can you tell us about?
Well, I was talking about the latecomer. The latecomer was not progressing. I kept sort of moving the deck chairs around, and the book kept sinking. And my editor, whom I trust absolutely, had turned it down twice. She had turned it down by saying, you need to write this again. It's going to be great, but I'm not buying it yet. Right. And it was hard to hear the first time and incredibly hard to hear the second time, because by the second time I was tapped out. I mean, I was really, pick your metaphor, in a corner, knocking my head against the wall, wandering around in the forest. I had
and did you agree with her when she said it? Did you agree, or were you thinking, I take her point?
I agreed with her. It's that I knew she was right. She wouldn't say it if it weren't right. I knew she wanted to publish it, and I knew she wanted to publish the version of it that was going to make everybody happy. And this apparently not it. So I was so upset about this meeting that I actually made my husband go with me. And that sounds bad, and it is bad. But I mean, I wanted him in the room with me, but he was actually across the street at Starbucks because he is more of a grown-up than I am. And it's a good thing he wasn't there, because, we're having this conversation, my editor and I, and I just started, I literally heard myself say, well, I have this other idea. And it's about this washed up writer who has nothing. He's tapped out, and he has this student, and the student is a real jerk. I mean, that, I don't know if you teach, but apparently this guy is in every single class. He's just the guy who's like, yeah, who are you? Yeah. But he has this brilliant idea. And then the student dies, and the teacher helps himself to the idea. He doesn't copy a single sentence. He's not a plagiarist, is he? But he takes the plot and he writes his own novel, and he becomes as successful as he has ever hoped to be. But then somebody comes out of the woodwork and accuses him of having stolen this book. And I could see her get more and more excited. And I was reassured, because I thought, okay, if the latecomer just never gets there, at least there's something else that I can do next. And then the next day I got a call from my agent saying, what just happened? You went in to talk about this book that wasn't working, and now I hear you've got this other novel and you're getting a 2-book contract. I mean, my editor went from I'm not buying this book to I am buying it, and I am buying something else that I didn't know it existed until yesterday. Right. And it was, maybe the most kind of transformative professional event of my life.
I bet. It must have been terrifying and exhilarating, though, was it?
Yeah.
Because then you had to go and write the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, I'd also been very, very nervous about the pandemic that I was sure was about to happen. And I had been all through the fall of 2019. And then it did begin a few weeks later. And it was like being shot out of a cannon, because I was so furious and I was so scared. And my husband and I were in a house that we own in upstate New York, just the two of us. And that is literally all I did for 4 months, is write. Wow. And then it was done. I mean, it was like an incredible contrast to The Latecomer, which I'd been working on for years and wasn't done, and was rewriting like crazy, whereas this thing just went straight out of the cannon. And
it kind of reads like it. I mean, it's an absolute page turner. So for people watching, I urge you to go out and get the plot, and you will not look up again.
People who are wondering what I'm doing being interviewed for Murder One with a novel that is not a crime novel, there's some compensation here.
There is, yes. You will get your money's worth, viewers, let me tell you, in terms of the crime angle. One thing I found really fascinating about it is that the plagiarism, it's not, as we've seen in other novels, somebody taking somebody else's manuscript and trying to pass it off.
Absolutely
it's
not.
The idea, it's not the execution. So it's much murkier in one way, isn't it?
Well, that's how the protagonist, Jake, defends it to himself. I mean, he's not copying. He's only seen a couple of pages of this thing. And I think he goes out of his way to not emulate even those pages. So he is taking the idea, he's putting it in a different place, creating the characters from scratch. But unfortunately, what he fails to consider is that the person he stole it from someone else, and that person has a different opinion about what they're seeing on the page. So that is the problem that he inherits without knowing that.
And the sort of the deep-seated unease that comes with that channels.
If he had been really at ease with what he did, he would have said so. He would have said, "Oh, I had this patient, it's a brilliant idea, and I took the." He didn't do that. I understand why he didn't do that, because, we're in a very volatile moment here as writers. And to be accused of something nefarious is pretty much almost as bad as being accused and convicted of doing something nefarious. So, in our world today, if I were to go on Twitter today and say, John Smith wrote a book and it's a bestseller, but he stole it. Boom. That may come to nothing in legal terms, but Smith.
You could destroy John Smith.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And John Smith could destroy me. And in fact, one of the interesting things, I chose to see it as interesting rather than offensive, but when the plot started to be read on places like Goodreads, I began to see ideas of places I had stolen my novel from. And they were, everything that had shared some kind of an element with the book. For example, any novel or movie depicting a writer who can't write, I had stolen from for the plot. Anything involving plagiarism, of course, I had stolen. I mean, there were kind of hilarious things, like somebody wrote, she stole that from season 4 of some TV show I didn't watch. And I decided to make a list of all the places I'd supposedly stolen this novel about stealing a novel from. It was very meta. But deep down, of course, you're offended too, because
and also, I suppose, because so much, like, writers are magpies. We do pick up little things all the time and not realize, and they end up in the nest for maybe quite a long time, and you don't know where they've originated from.
That is absolutely true, and that goes to and it's our deep fear, and it also explains why we obsess about plagiarism in novels. And I think another way to put that is that deep down, we all fear that we're doing it. Even
of course.
We would never knowingly do it, but sometimes, and I wonder if this happens to you, you'll write a sentence and you'll stop for a minute and you'll say, have I read that before? That sounded familiar. That cadence, that collection of words did I really just write that, or am I remembering it? Because I mean, I look at the bookshelves behind you. You can kind of see some of mine. We are readers, and we've been readers, since we were little kids, and all of that stuff is churning around in there, mixing together. We remember some of it better than others. I was walking down the street once with not a close friend, but an acquaintance who's also a writer. I was literally walking down the street with her, and we were talking, and I suddenly remembered something that she had once told me that I had put into a novel. And I just stopped there, and I said, I have to tell you something. And I told her what I'd done. And she was, I think, quite miffed about it. But she, being a writer, she also understood.
She got it. Yeah.
It was in there rattling around. And I'd forgotten where I'd heard it. And I'd forgotten that I'd heard it. And it is in my novel, You Should Have Known, right now.
Yeah. And one of the things I do love about the plot is how incredibly successful he is with the book. I just think that's so, it's like all the writer fantasies all coming to life.
I get him all of them.
Let him side theaters. It's just fantastic. Yeah.
I mean, why not go there if you're not going to just like upchuck your lifetime's worth of, jealous, teeth gnashing, and why didn't that happen to me experiences? So sure, I gave everything.
He really enjoyed it.
Had every, hold for Steven Spielberg, please.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. But the irony is he can't enjoy any of it because he's terrified that somebody will come out of the woodwork and ruin it, which of course is
that he's going to get nabbed. Absolutely. Yeah. It's very entertaining in that the whole life of the writer in it. And also I found, I wrote a book about a couple of years ago which featured a forged sequel to Dracula. And I've been writing it for a little while when I realized I was going to have to write some of a forged sequel to Dracula in order to have it in this book. So did you always plan to have parts of the book that he's written of Crib in it?
Well, I said that it came pouring out in 4 months, and it did. But I had told my editor in that fateful conversation about this book that I was just thinking up on the spot that there would be these chapters of Jake's novel, which is called Crib, in the book. And when I was in the middle of writing it, I happened to listen to a podcast with Lily King about her book. It's right up here on my shelf, but I won't try to get it. Her novel is called Writers and Lovers, and it's about a woman who's writing a novel. And the interviewer asked her, did you think about writing some excerpts of this book so that we could read it? And she said, I decided that nothing I wrote would be good enough to justify how brilliantly this book does. And I thought, oh, fantastic. She's not writing hers. I don't have to write mine. So when I turned in the plot, it did not have any of those excerpts. And my editor said, weren't you going to write the excerpts of Crib? And I said, well, Lily King's not writing hers, so I don't have to write mine. And she said, no, you have to write yours. So that was really the only edit that I had to do, the only addition to that first draft. I mean, there were little nips and tucks here and there, but I had to go back and write those excerpts. And I was here to do it because, what's the last thing you want to do when you finish writing a novel? Writing another novel.
Write a little novel inside the novel.
That's right. It's just excerpts. You're just sort of zooming in on these key scenes, but you still have to create the story, create the characters, name the characters, decide who dies of what disease, how does this happen? I mean, it was like, okay, let's go back in. But of course she was right. She's always right. It did have to be done. And I did it.
And it works so well as the world within the world. Are you ever tempted to write Crib, the book?
I was asked that. I have been asked that. Why didn't you just write the plot? And all I can, I think if I had only come up with that plot, I might have done that. But it was always part of this, these two stories concurrently, the story within the story. And that was how it was conceived. And
I know it works so well. It is because it's that idea of passing. There's one story passing within another story, even as Jake is trying to pass himself off as something that he isn't, that nobody else can see in him.
That's the great drama of our human lives. We're all faking it till we make it. I spent years being terrified to write a novel. And at some point you don't think, now I'm ready. Now I'm going to write a great novel. You think, now I'm going to pretend that I can write a novel long enough to actually write one. Yeah. And that's how you get yourself to do it, or at least every writer I've ever talked to about this. There's some like, today I'm a little bit stronger than my fear, just this much stronger. So I'm just going to sit down and
just enough to see what will happen when I try and write something.
Get the words on the page. And it's all about just telling that voice that's screaming at you that it's never going to happen. And even if it does happen, it'll be terrible. Just getting that voice to just shut up, not forever, just long enough for me to just try to do something here.
Yeah. And then what's it like when you do that? So you write the book, say, for example, You Should Have Known, and then that becomes an adaptation, which isn't exactly the same. It's
not exactly.
Not exactly. So what does that feel like then to see? Do you sort of just give it over then and think it's a different thing? It's no longer my thing, and just enjoy it as a spectator?
I learned that with Admission. I mean, Admission was not a comedy. But the adaptation went in the direction of comedy because of the people who were in it. And it really was a variation on a theme. And the first time I read the script, I really had to go lie down. I was so upset. But I'm glad that happened back in 2013 with Admission, because by the time The Undoing came around, which was massively different, I mean, it made the Admission look like a faithful adaptation. I was just, sure, whatever. Okay. I mean, it was David E. Kelley, whose work I've been watching since the 80s. What was I going to do? Tell him how to do his job? He had said from the beginning, it's going to be, I'm going to take these characters in this situation, and then I'm going to go in a different direction. And I said, fine. Yeah. So that's
it. Sort of flips. It flips so much of your writing and what we're talking about, and that it's not actually a fake it till you make it. It's to say Hugh Grant's character in The Undoing. Well, he's made it and now has to fake it. So it's sort of reversed.
Well, he's
idea.
Work. He's. Yeah, well, I'm just in case there's anybody out there who hasn't seen it yet, I won't say, but I will say that Hugh Grant's character is barely in my book. I mean, every time I rewrote the book, I took him out more and more. I think I got him down to a text message or an email or something. It was totally necessary. I couldn't get around, and there's a letter from him, but the book is not about him. It's not about whether he did it. It's about her. And, she's this therapist, and in the book, and they cut this out of the TV show, she's just written a book herself called You Should Have Known, which is basically telling women in particular that they have all the information, that we all have this need to create narratives for our own ends, and whether that's to excuse behavior of somebody we love, or to give ourselves courage, or whatever it may be. But you don't see what's right in front of you, because the need to create the narrative is so overpowering for all of us. So that's what she's about to publish this book, and go on the road and tell people, believe them when they tell you the first time, because they're telling you the truth. And then she discovers that her entire life is based on a series of falsehoods. So that, it was her coming apart and putting herself together, which was the whole second half of the book.
Yeah, which is a completely different take to what happened on screen, for sure. Have you ever written screenplays? Are you interested in writing?
I would love to. And I had hoped that I would have a small part to play in the writing of the plot, but I'm not involved. That is wending its way towards a television adaptation.
Oh, great. When will that be on air, on screens? Do you know?
I can't say exactly when, but I think they're starting to film it in January.
Oh, exciting. That's quite
and it's going to star Mahershala Ali, which will be another new direction. And the Latecomer also has been optioned for an adaptation. So, but that's much earlier on. We don't know who, when, where, what.
Okay. And are these, would your preference be to be more involved in how these get realized on screen, or are you?
I would love to be, but not because I don't trust the people who are doing the adaptation. I just selfishly want to learn how to do that. And I'd love to be given an opportunity to contribute to that. Yeah. It's not that I don't think they're perfectly capable of doing a good job. I figure nobody is going to hire me to be in the writer's room for an adaptation that I didn't happen to have written the novel for. So I really hope it does happen. But also I now have, I have to write more books. Now I have a contract for to write other books. So probably it would be best if I just did my work.
Concentrated on the job you already have. Yeah. Okay. And is Book the Writer? Is that initiative running this?
Yeah. We have our first. We have 15 events this fall. That's the biggest schedule we've had. Book the Writer is a little business that I started, and what we do is we have these. We have conversations with writers in private homes in Manhattan, but over the pandemic, we also went online. So now we're doing this hybrid thing where, we have Steve Martin and his the cartoonist that he works with talking about his new book in November. Will be 20 people in a living room on the Upper West Side, but we'll also have the Zoom going, and people can send in questions over that. But yeah,
it seems like such a simple twist on the book club format, but yet so significant to have an author in the room.
Yes, and the other thing is that we ask everybody to read the book before the book group, because we don't want to. You can go to your local bookstore for a book launch event and ask the author, "What is your book about?" But if everybody's read the book, we're all already on to the next thing, and the conversations can get very intricate and intimate, and sometimes you end up laughing like crazy, and the great thing is watching people sit down with an author whose work they've loved for years, or discover a new author. So
that must be amazing. Do you find you have regular people go to all of them, or does it depend? Right, it's more.
Well, the great thing about each of these events is that the audience are self-selecting. So if you love thrillers, we have Chris Pavone this fall. You may not be interested in a first literary novel by somebody whose work you've never heard of. So it's great to see the deck get shuffled. We have about 3,000 people now on our mailing list, and I'd say we probably have a core group of about 100 who turn up a lot. But we cap the in-person to 20 because we never want it to feel like a big lecture. We want it to be a conversation, and we're looking forward to the day when we can all put our masks down and go back to having a little bit of wine with our literary conversation. But for now, we're going to keep our masks on in the room until we're really out the back of this thing.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think the upside, I realize that's a downside for the people in the room, but the upside for the rest of us now that it's gone hybrid is that we can join online, and I think it's really interesting.
You can have a drink if you want. Yes. And we have the technology now in the form of a couple of great interns to really manage the Zooms so that I don't have to be, staring at my lap throughout the whole thing. And so far we haven't had any technical issues. And I'll tell you one thing, during the pandemic, we had one of these Book the Writer events with David Duchovny.
Right.
All women from all over the world. I'd heard from a lot of them beforehand. Am I going to be able to talk to David Duchovny? Can I ask David Duchovny a question? They were so well behaved during the conversation itself that I was so curious. And after it was over, I went online and they were all going insane on Twitter. Oh my God! So it was very funny, but it was a really interesting book, and we had really interesting conversation with him. And so thank you, technology.
Great. Well, it's been a significant upside for things like that for sure. Yeah. I do have a couple of questions that we got sent in from people that I want to move on to, but just before we do, can you talk a little bit about what you're working on now, or is it too early?
It's very early, but my attempt is what I'm hoping to do is to write a sequel to the plot, actually.
Oh, exciting.
That is the goal. We'll see how it works out.
Oh, brilliant. Well, best of luck with that. I really hope that one works out. I'd love to read it. I guess, so I do have a couple of questions that were sent in by people. This first one, well, I would imagine this is from a writer, actually, because it is, when you're not writing, do you panic about not writing and wonder if you'll never write again?
That is totally
relax into it and enjoy the downtime?
That is totally from a writer. I had hoped, I usually give myself like 6 months of guilt-free not writing. Then the panic starts like clockwork. Until now, nobody has been out there waiting for me. I've been blessedly unpaid attention to over 8 novels. I never had to sort of worry about the idea that people were saying, okay, where's the next one? Now I do feel that a little bit. So it's a different kind of thing. But yeah, listen, you never get to lose the fear. This is the one thing that people have this assumption, this crazy assumption that if you've done it once or twice or 8 times, the fear is a thing of the past. And maybe for some people it is, but for me, it never will be. So learning to live with the fear and with the, just the fear that you won't write again, the fear that you will write again, but it'll be terrible. I mean, you don't get out from under that. Yeah. So I certainly don't expect to.
I think the fear is quite a necessary part of the process. I find it's not just that writing is about showing up. I think it's about showing up and maybe being a little bit scared about what's going to happen next. And that's how you really...
It's hard for me to imagine that Philip Roth or Norman Mailer sat around being worried all the time like I am, and like virtually every other writer I know is, maybe it's a girl thing. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah. But I certainly don't expect to be liberated from this ever. So yeah, I read, I think, I have a life, I have Book the Writer, there's other stuff going on, but that clock in your head is always ticking, like, you didn't write today, why not? Yeah. Maybe you never write again. Maybe you will, but
you're over. Yeah. And this question, which I know is definitely from a crime writer, actually, it's: are you a plotter or a pantser? So are you
another one of these questions that we've never heard until recently? And I remember the first time I was asked what my process was. It was 2011. I remember vividly where I was and who asked me, and I had no idea what this person was talking about. I thought they were talking about my hair. Seriously, because I knew, single process. That's when they put all the dye on, and I did dye my hair then, so I could have said, yes, it's a single process. I don't know. I mean, I think some, but you don't know everything. If you do know everything before you start, it's fatal. And that goes back to the fear. Can I really start sentence 1? It was a dark and stormy night, not knowing what's going to happen on page 311? You have to.
Yeah. Do you think that's related to, I think, the fact that you kind of move, you sort of dance between genres, it seems really easily, so do you think they're related, those things that, if you were, say, still doing legal thrillers, you would probably have the idea of plot, just honed down like that. Whereas because you're moving between things, they all need their own approach and their own way of telling a story.
But I never think of genre first. I mean, it's almost like other people tell me. I mean, when The Latecomer was published, I'm suddenly reading about how I'm this 19th century novelist. And hey, I mean, I love 19th century novels. I don't have a problem with that. But it's sort of not up to me. I didn't set out to say, no, I'm going to write a 19th century novel that has no murder in it.
Yeah.
Just as I didn't set out to write the plot as a crime novel. I mean, it got kind of absorbed into this crime genre, just as You Should Have Known was, even though I hadn't thought of it that way either. I mean, plot is really important. Characters are important. Plot twists are super important. Every sentence has to be as well written as it can be. That's enough. I've got to come up with a genre too.
Yeah.
I think, another reason that it took me so long to kind of break through is that people do stay within their genres, and I kept kind of flitting around, and And I would walk into a bookstore and, often they didn't have my books at all. But if they did, where were they? Were they in the literary? Were they in the thriller? I don't even read mysteries. And I was called a mystery writer. I've never been very curious about who did it. I don't
Okay.
really.
Did you ever have conversations with your editor or agent in any of this time where they're trying to channel you towards one or the other?
No, I think I have been with the right editor and the right agent for a long time now. And I think they understand my idiosyncrasies. They understand that if they don't hover over me and try to micromanage me, one day I'm going to call them and say, guess what? I have a novel for you to read now. And that's served us all really well. But no, they never did that, to their great credit.
Oh, okay. Because one of the devices I loved in The Latecomer, and I was kind of imagining some editors would have wanted it removed, was that sort of quite 19th century chapter descriptions.
Oh, I know.
Where the chapters were in. But they have these little turns on them. So there's the one about Sally discovers the mosh pit of adult life. So they feel like they're actually going to have the sort of maybe George Eliot sort of quality to it, but they're completely subverting themselves at the same time, and they're enormously
they were so much fun to write. They were as much fun to write as those excerpts of the college application essays in it.
Yeah, they seemed like such fun, actually. You're clearly really enjoying yourself in those excerpts. Did you write those chapter headings before you started the chapter? Did you go back and resolve them afterwards? Like, what was their sequence in the...
I think I wrote them late in the day because there was so much moving around. It would have been counterproductive to write them too soon. But they were really, really fun to do. Yeah. When I never really considered an academic career, but when I was at university in England, my area of interest was 18th century fiction and the sort of the rise of the novel. And so that's really where that came from. It's my little homage to the early novel.
Right. Well, they have that sort of lyrical quality that you allow the sentences to go around in a couple of different directions and resolve themselves. It doesn't all have to be very tight, strict prose. I like the way they can open up and narrow down again as they need to. Do you? One thing I have been asked to ask you by another question is, because your husband Paul Muldoon is Irish, do you visit Ireland at all?
Yeah, I was in Ireland for 2 weeks this summer. I was the merch girl for my husband's tour. He and his band toured. We were in Limerick, Letterkenny, Belfast, and Dublin. So he does this thing called Muldoon's Picnic, and it's a kind of variety show with his band and then writers and musicians who join the show as it moves around. So that was a lot of fun. We were in Dingle for a while, where we lived in 1986, and saw some old friends there. I mean, I really love Ireland. So
you must have got to do a great tour of the country during the summer then for 2 weeks. That sounds lovely.
Everybody was complaining about how hot it was, but compared to how hot New York was, everybody was.
It doesn't take much though to get us going.
The goat was the Puck Fair goat. It was at that time. Everybody was obsessed with the goat.
Yeah, the poor old goat overheating in its cage.
Right.
Yeah. And one last reader question, which I have actually, or a listener question rather, for the festival that's in it, Murder One. When you're writing a murder, if you're writing a murder, what do you reckon is a good choice of weapon? Do you have a favourite way that you would take somebody out?
I'm very squeamish about violence, so I am unlikely to. I mean, the way that the murder was depicted in The Undoing, for example, I don't think I ever specified how the murder was done in the novel that I wrote, but I probably would not have gone full gore like that. When it came to violence in the plot, I took some advice from a close friend. She and her daughters are both avid mystery readers, and they helped me. So I probably would tend to skew less violent, but there are so many ways. There's so many ways to kill somebody.
Which is one of the enjoyable things.
The problem is not getting caught. I mean, it's easy to kill. Yeah. Not so hard to do it and not get caught.
Yeah, Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jean, for your time. It's been absolutely lovely having you as a guest.
I just want to ask you about A Talented Man, and is that a Ripley reference?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
it is absolutely. It's partly my homage to Ripley, even though it's set in 1938, about a forger who decides to forge a sequel to Dracula and make his fortune.
Oh, that's your Dracula book. Okay, I'm going to read that. Because there's a Ripley element in the plot as well.
Ripley College is it's actually really good.
Ripley
when
College?
there's a name for a college, it makes a lot of sense.
It's a great name. And also there's a character named Talented Tom, who's a bit of a Ripley.
Yes, the emailer. Yeah, I really loved all those Ripley references through it. He's a character that just never goes away in
really
culture.
does.
He just
And I have to say, I mean, I have now read all 4 of the Ripley books, and I don't think they're great novels. It's the first one is great. The second one is pretty good. And then I think it goes off a little bit. But she was such a fascinating woman herself. I've actually just seen this documentary about her in New York, about her personal life. And I've read a biography of her as well. She was she wrote comic books in New York.
Yeah, I read that biography as well. She's really fascinating. I mean, I'm not sure I'd like to have met her necessarily. She sounds like quite a tough person to try and talk to. But I'm the same. I love the first Ripley book, and then it's slightly a descending scale. By the time he's able to completely shapeshift with some putty on his face, I think, oh, come on, surely. I think it gets a little implausible. But the inside, the dark heart of the character is just so beautifully written.
Yeah. He does know how to live well. I will say, I learned a lot about the good life from reading about Ripley's life. But,
yeah, it does. It sounds absolutely delightful. Yeah.
Well,
thank you so much for coming to Murder One. It's been an absolute fantastic talking to you, and cannot wait to read a sequel to the plot. I would love it. I would read it now if I could.
That's me.
So can you write a bit faster? Can you just hurry up a bit there, please?
Yeah. But I will. I remember that you said that as part of my battalion of weapons to beat back my fear and get to the computer.
Excellent. Oh, well, thank you so much. I'll hand back to Vanessa now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. And that was absolutely fascinating, Jean, to hear that somebody of your calibre is feeling the fear as well makes us all feel a little bit better. And honestly, I have to say that last question, Henrietta, about the murder weapon is just the best ever I think I've ever heard. So thank you so much. That's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you guys out there for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you at hopefully another online event for Murder One. We've got all sorts of things happening. And a star-packed, star-studded programme coming up over the following weekend. So we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.